The lights that shouldn't exist. The first person to notice the lights was a delivery driver heading home through the industrial district. He almost missed them. The rain was coming down hard, smearing the windshield with silver streaks. The road beside Riverside Turbine Works was usually empty at that hour, a forgotten stretch of cracked asphalt lined with weeds and rusted fencing. Most people avoided it after dark. The factory had been dead for 12 years. That was simply a fact of life in Millhaven. Like the abandoned storefronts downtown. Like the faded company logo still visible on the water tower. Like the silence that settled over the town after the closure. So when the driver glanced toward the factory and saw pale yellow floodlights glowing through the rain, he slowed instinctively. For a moment he thought he was mistaken. Then he rolled down the window. The sound of rainfall filled the cab. The lights remained steady, real. By morning, half the town was talking about it. Nobody had answers. The power company insisted service to the property had been disconnected years ago. The county records office couldn't even determine who technically owned the site anymore. A development company had purchased it after the shutdown. Then another company bought that company. Then there had been lawsuits, bankruptcies, and legal disputes that stretched across several states. Eventually, everyone stopped paying attention. The factory simply became part of the landscape, a giant rusting monument to better days. By noon, people were posting blurry photographs online. Some showed illuminated windows. Others claimed they had seen movement inside. One image captured what appeared to be fresh tire tracks near the western loading docks. Rumors spread quickly. Security contractors, trespassers, developers, government inspectors. Nobody knew. Most people shrugged and returned to their routines. But Calvin Mercer couldn't stop thinking about it. He sat alone inside Murphy's repair garage, staring at a photograph on his phone, while an old space heater clicked beside his workbench. The factory lights reflected through the rain like distant stars. A customer stood nearby waiting for an estimate. Calvin realized he hadn't heard a word the man had said. "You all right?" Calvin blinked. "Sorry?" "The transmission." The customer pointed toward his pickup. "You were looking at it." "Oh." Calvin rubbed a hand across his jaw. "Yeah, right." The customer followed his gaze toward the phone screen. "The old plant?" Calvin nodded. "Looks that way." "Strange. Very." The customer shrugged. "Maybe somebody finally bought the place." Maybe, but Calvin doubted it. There were details most people wouldn't notice. The pattern of illumination, the sections that were lit, the sequence. Whoever turned those lights on knew the facility. Not casually, not from blueprints. They knew it the way a sailor knows a ship, or a mechanic knows an engine. The realization sat heavily in his chest all afternoon, because Calvin knew the factory too. For 32 years, Riverside Turbine Works had been part of his life. He knew which pipes froze first in winter, which motors overheated during summer production runs, which staircases rattled under heavy loads. He could navigate most of the building blindfolded, at least he once could, back when the place had been alive, back before everything changed. Outside, evening arrived early beneath low storm clouds. By the time Calvin locked the garage, rain had intensified. The windshield wipers groaned across the glass as he drove toward home. Without consciously deciding to, he turned onto Industrial Road. The factory appeared gradually through sheets of rain, massive, dark, familiar. His chest tightened. 12 years hadn't made it any smaller. The smokestacks still pierced the sky. The turbine hall still stretched across several acres. Rows of broken windows reflected passing headlights. And there, the lights, exactly as the photograph showed. Floodlights burned along the southern maintenance yard. Not all of them, just specific sections, intentional sections. Calvin pulled onto the shoulder. The engine idled softly. Rain drummed against the roof. For several minutes he simply watched, trying to understand, trying to convince himself there had to be an ordinary explanation. Then he noticed something else. The perimeter fence. At first glance it looked unchanged, but years of maintenance work had trained his eyes. One panel near the western gate was newer than the others, fresh galvanized steel, recently installed. Someone had repaired it. Not the county, not vandals, professionals. A cold feeling settled in his stomach. He stepped from the truck. Rain soaked his jacket immediately. The wind carried familiar smells across the property. Wet concrete, rust, machine oil lingering deep within old structures. For a brief moment, it felt as though the years had collapsed, as though he were returning to a night shift, returning to a life that no longer existed. Calvin approached the fence slowly. Beyond it, the maintenance yard stretched toward the turbine building. Puddles shimmered beneath floodlights. Nothing moved. No workers, no vehicles, no security patrols. Just rain. Then he heard it. A vibration. Faint, almost lost beneath the weather. Calvin froze. His entire body went still. There it was again. Deep, rhythmic, mechanical. Not a loose panel. Not wind. Not thunder. A machine. A large one. Years of experience recognized the sound before his conscious mind did. His pulse quickened. Impossible. He stepped closer, listening carefully. The vibration rolled through the ground itself, subtle but unmistakable. Somewhere inside Riverside Turbine Works, a turbine generator was running. Not fully loaded, not at production capacity, but running. Calvin stared through the rain toward the dark silhouette of the turbine hall. The factory had been silent for 12 years. Yet now, beneath the storm, he could hear its heartbeat again, and whoever had brought it back to life knew exactly what they were doing. The things people left unsaid. Calvin barely slept. The sound of the generator followed him home. Not literally. By the time he left the factory fence, the rain had grown so heavy that even the distant vibration disappeared beneath the storm. Yet long after midnight, lying awake in his small house on the edge of town, he could still feel it in his memory. A machine that should have been silent, a building that should have been empty, and someone who clearly knew the factory well enough to bring part of it back to life. By dawn, the storm had moved east. The town woke beneath low clouds and wet streets that reflected pale morning light. Calvin poured coffee into a chipped mug and sat at the kitchen table. The room was quiet except for the ticking of an old wall clock. Across from him hung a framed photograph taken nearly 20 years earlier. A company picnic, hundreds of workers gathered beside the river. Families, children, retirees, people who had believed the factory would outlive all of them. Calvin found himself studying faces he hadn't seen in years. Some had moved away, some had died, others simply disappeared into different lives after the shutdown. His gaze stopped on a young woman standing near the back of the group. Dark hair tied beneath a baseball cap, safety glasses hanging from her collar. Half hidden behind taller workers, Elena Ruiz. The name from the notebook. The signature he had found inside the turbine hall. He leaned back slowly. It didn't make sense, not yet, but it was the only lead he had. By mid-morning, he was driving toward the county records office. The building occupied what had once been an elementary school administration center. The lobby smelled faintly of paper, dust, and old heating vents. Behind a desk sat Linda Carver, who had known Calvin most of his life. She looked up from her computer. "Calvin Mercer. You still working here?" She laughed, unfortunately. He smiled. "Need a favor." "That usually means paperwork." "It does." Her smile faded slightly. "What are you looking for?" "Riverside." The reaction was immediate. Not fear, not surprise, just the familiar expression everyone wore whenever the factory came up. A mixture of nostalgia and discomfort. Like discussing someone who had been gone a long time. Linda sighed. "You're not the first person asking questions this week." "Who else?" "Reporters, town council members, curious residents." She turned toward her computer. "Nobody's finding much." For nearly an hour they searched records, ownership transfers, tax disputes, environmental inspections, legal filings. The trail twisted through shell companies and dissolved corporations. Nothing explained the recent activity. Nothing identified who currently occupied the site. But one detail stood out. A series of engineering permits filed over the previous 18 months. Minor structural work, electrical restoration, water system repairs. The permits listed a consulting engineer, Elena Ruiz. Calvin stared at the screen. The same name, again, and again, and again. Not hidden, not secret, just buried beneath thousands of pages nobody bothered reading. Linda glanced toward him. "You know her?" "A long time ago." "She local?" "Used to be." Linda nodded. "Looks like she works out west now." Calvin copied the information. For the first time, the mystery felt less like a ghost story and more like a person. A real person. Making deliberate choices. Yet one question remained. Why? Why spend nearly 2 years restoring portions of a dead factory nobody wanted? The answer didn't arrive immediately. Instead, another clue found him. That evening, Calvin returned to the plant. This time he parked farther away. The storm had cleared. Cold air swept through the empty industrial district. Above him, stars appeared between moving clouds. The factory lights were still on. Calvin crossed a section of overgrown service road and reached the perimeter fence. The repaired panels stood where he remembered. Closer inspection revealed fresh bolts and new welds. Professional work. Someone expected this place to remain active. He followed the fence line until he reached a section hidden by dense brush. Years earlier, maintenance crews had used the area as an emergency access route. Most people wouldn't know it existed. Calvin did. A gap remained between two damaged sections of fencing, just wide enough. He slipped through. The factory grounds felt strangely different at night. Not abandoned, not exactly. More like a building waking slowly from a long sleep. Lights glowed from maintenance corridors. Certain windows illuminated sections of concrete yard. Far away, he heard the low hum of equipment, working equipment. Not many machines, just enough. He moved carefully between structures, past storage tanks, past loading bays, past maintenance sheds covered in rust. Memories surfaced with every step. Places where co-workers once gathered during breaks. Areas where forklifts moved non-stop during production years. Corners where jokes were told and arguments settled. The silence made everything feel larger, almost sacred. Eventually, he reached the turbine hall. One side entrance stood partially open. Calvin hesitated, then stepped inside. The smell hit him first. Machine oil, metal, warm electrical equipment, fresh grease, the sense of industry. Sense that hadn't existed here in over a decade. Dim overhead lights stretched into the distance. Massive turbines occupied the center floor like sleeping giants. Most remained inactive, but one unit near the far end was operating. Not loudly, not aggressively, just steadily. Its rotating shaft reflected amber light. Calvin stared. The machine looked healthier than it had during the factory's final years. Someone had maintained it carefully. Then he noticed a workbench. Tools, parts, engineering diagrams, maintenance logs, coffee mugs, signs of daily activity. Someone had built a workspace here. He approached slowly. Pages covered the table. Handwritten notes, technical calculations, inspection reports, sketches. Many were signed. Elena Ruiz. The same handwriting appeared over and over. Precise, organized, confident. Nothing like the shy apprentice he remembered. Calvin picked up one notebook. Inside were detailed observations about structural integrity, climate systems, electrical distribution, and preservation equipment. Preservation equipment. He frowned. The phrase appeared repeatedly. Not production systems, not manufacturing upgrades. Preservation, storage, environmental protection. The terminology felt strange, unexpected. A noise interrupted his thoughts. Footsteps. Calvin turned immediately. The sound echoed through the enormous hall, steady, approaching, not hurried, not frightened. Whoever it was knew exactly where they were going. The footsteps stopped several yards away. For a moment, neither person spoke. Then a woman's voice broke the silence. Older than he remembered. Calmer. You're still terrible at sneaking through facilities. Calvin stared. The woman standing beneath the overhead lights wore a heavy work jacket and carried a flashlight. There were gray strands in her dark hair now, fine lines around her eyes, years visible in ways photographs never capture. Yet he recognized her instantly. Elena Ruiz. She lowered the flashlight. A faint smile touched her face. Hello, Calvin. He looked around the hall, at the machinery, the restored systems, the active generator, the months, perhaps years of work surrounding them, then back at her. I've got one question. She folded her arms. Only one? For now. The smile faded. His voice softened. Why? Elena looked toward the turbine. Its steady hum filled the space between them. For several seconds she said nothing, as though deciding where to begin. Finally she spoke. You remember teaching me how these machines worked? Calvin blinked. What does that have to do with this? Everything. The answer carried unexpected weight. Not accusation, not praise. Something more complicated. Something unfinished. Elena glanced toward a staircase leading deeper into the facility, toward sections of the factory Calvin had not yet explored. Her expression changed. Not mysterious, not dramatic, simply serious. There are things down here people forgot existed. Calvin followed her gaze. The old unease returned. What things? Elena looked back at him. And for the first time since he entered the building, genuine urgency appeared in her eyes. "If we don't save them soon," she said quietly, "they'll be gone forever." The turbine continued humming. Somewhere deep beneath the factory, hidden beyond concrete floors and decades of neglect, a secret waited. And whatever it was had become important enough for someone to bring an abandoned factory back to life. The last thing the factory was built to do. For a moment, neither of them moved. The turbine's steady vibration traveled through the concrete beneath their feet. Calvin studied Elena's face, searching for clues. He expected a business proposal, an investor, maybe a redevelopment plan, something practical, something familiar. Instead, he found concern, the kind that comes from carrying responsibility for too long. "Save what?" he asked. Elena glanced toward the staircase again, then she started walking. "Come with me." The stairwell descended below the turbine hall. Calvin frowned. He had spent more than 3 decades inside Riverside Turbine Works. He knew every maintenance corridor, every equipment room, every service tunnel, or at least he thought he did. The stairs led lower than he remembered, past utility levels, past electrical control rooms, past old storage areas. The air grew cooler. The sounds of the generator faded behind concrete walls. Only their footsteps remained. At the bottom, Elena unlocked a steel security door. The hinges groaned softly. Beyond it stretched a corridor illuminated by newly installed LED lights. The walls showed signs of recent repairs, fresh wiring, new drainage systems, humidity sensors. Industrial dehumidifiers hummed quietly. Calvin stopped. "What is this?" Elena looked at him. Something they never told most workers about. She pushed open another door, and Calvin forgot what he was about to say. The room beyond was enormous. Rows of shelving extended into the distance. Thousands of storage boxes, metal cabinets, film canisters, blueprint drawers, photograph archives, audio recording equipment, document collections, entire sections labeled by decade: 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, 1990s. The sheer scale left him speechless, not because it was dramatic, because it was real, painfully real. Evidence of lives, generations of them, people he had worked beside, people who had built the town itself. The forgotten history of Riverside Turbine Works, preserved underground, waiting. "Good Lord," Calvin whispered. Elena nodded. My reaction was about the same. He walked forward slowly. His hand brushed against a row of archival boxes. Each carried handwritten labels, family names, departments, projects, retirement interviews, employee histories, union records, factory newsletters, photographs, letters, training manuals, the entire life of the factory stored beneath it. "How long has this been here?" "Since the beginning." Calvin turned toward her. "Why didn't anybody know?" "Some people knew," she sighed. "Most retired. Others passed away. Ownership changed so many times that records disappeared." She walked toward a nearby table. Spread across it were engineering reports, inspection photographs, moisture readings, structural assessments. The archive survived because of climate control systems built into the foundation. She tapped one report. "They stopped working years ago." Calvin understood immediately. Moisture, mold, groundwater. Paper didn't survive long without protection. How bad? Elena hesitated. Bad enough. He looked around at the boxes, the photographs, the shelves. Lives reduced to fragile records. How long? Months. The answer hung heavily between them. Not years, months. Without intervention, everything could disappear. A century of memory, gone. Calvin slowly sat in a nearby chair. For several moments he simply stared, trying to absorb it, trying to understand why this affected him so deeply. Then his eyes landed on a familiar name, Mercer. He stood again, crossed the room, pulled a box from a shelf. Inside were photographs, employee evaluations, retirement documents, maintenance records, and a cassette tape. The label read, Thomas Mercer. Oral history interview, 1988. Calvin froze. His father. He hadn't heard that name spoken aloud in years. His father had worked at Riverside before him, one of the original maintenance supervisors. A man who rarely discussed emotions. A man whose conversations usually revolved around machinery, responsibility, and work. A man gone for more than 3 decades. Elena watched quietly. You can play it. Calvin looked up. What? She pointed toward a restoration workstation. We digitized some recordings. For a moment he couldn't move. Then he carried the tape carefully across the room. His hands felt strangely unsteady. Elena loaded the recording, pressed play. Static filled the speakers. A brief hiss. Then a voice. Older, rough around the edges, unmistakable. Thomas Mercer. Calvin felt the breath leave his lungs. Not because the recording contained anything extraordinary, it didn't. His father simply talked. About working night shifts. About repairing turbines during winter storms. About raising a family. About coworkers. About responsibility. Ordinary things. But hearing the voice again after 30 years felt impossible, like finding a doorway where none should exist. Across the room, Elena quietly stepped away, giving him privacy. The recording continued. At one point his father laughed, a sound Calvin realized he had almost forgotten. That hurt more than he expected. Not sharply, softly, the way old memories sometimes do. When the recording ended, neither spoke immediately. The silence felt appropriate. Finally, Elena returned. Now you understand. Calvin nodded, slowly. He did. This wasn't about reopening a factory. It wasn't about money. It wasn't about development. This was about people. Their stories, their work, their lives. Everything that would vanish if nobody cared enough to save it. The following weeks changed the town. At first only a handful of volunteers arrived. Former workers, retirees, family members, people curious about the rumors. Then more came, and more. Word spread. Boxes were cataloged, photographs scanned, recordings digitized, documents preserved. Entire weekends disappeared into restoration work. Something unexpected happened during the process. People started talking. Not online, not through headlines. Face to face. Old coworkers reunited. Families discovered forgotten photographs. Children learned where their grandparents had worked. Neighbors who hadn't spoken in years shared stories over folding tables and coffee thermoses. The factory wasn't producing anything, yet somehow it was creating something valuable again. Connection, memory, belonging. One snowy evening, nearly 4 months after Calvin first saw the lights, the final preservation system was installed. The archive was safe. For the first time in decades, its future was secure. Volunteers gathered inside the turbine hall. Nothing formal. Peaceful. No grand ceremony. Just tired people standing together. The generator that had protected the archive hummed nearby. Steady, reliable. Its work complete. Calvin stood beside Elena, overlooking the machinery. You did all this because of something I taught you? Elena smiled faintly. Not just you. Still. She looked toward the volunteers. When I was 17, most people assumed I didn't belong here. Calvin remembered. Some of the older workers hadn't taken her seriously. You didn't. He shook his head. No. You showed me how things worked. Her voice softened. You treated me like I belonged. Calvin looked away, embarrassed by the praise, yet strangely grateful for it. Because sometimes people never learn what their small acts meant to someone else. Sometimes they never know. Outside, snow drifted past the windows. Inside, the old factory glowed with warm light. Not because production had returned, not because industry had been revived, but because people had. Months later, the generators were shut down. The turbines fell silent once more. The factory officially remained closed. Yet every Saturday, visitors arrived. School groups, families, researchers, former workers. The underground archive had become a public museum and community history center. The last thing Riverside Turbine Works ever produced wasn't machinery. It was memory. One evening, long after the visitors had gone home, Calvin stood alone inside a small exhibit room. A recording played softly through hidden speakers. His father's voice, steady, familiar, alive in the only way voices can remain alive. Calvin listened quietly. Outside, sunset painted the old factory walls in shades of gold and amber. The building still carried its scars, broken brick, weathered steel, years of wear, but it no longer felt abandoned. The factory had not returned to life, not in the way people first imagined. Something better had happened. Its purpose had changed, and somehow after all these years, that felt enough. Calvin smiled faintly and listened as his father's voice echoed through the room. Then, beyond the windows, evening settled gently over Riverside Turbine Works, and for the first time since the shutdown, the silence felt enough. The voices that stayed. A year later, most people in Millhaven no longer talked about the night the factory lights came back on, at least not the way they once had. The mystery was gone. The rumors had faded. The strange photograph shared online had been buried beneath newer headlines and newer distractions. But the building remained, and every Saturday morning the parking lot filled again, not with employees, not with freight trucks, not with production crews, with visitors, families, students, former workers carrying memories they hadn't touched in years. The old security gate still stood near the entrance. Rust remained along portions of the fence. The smokestacks still rose above town like weathered monuments. From a distance, Riverside Turbine Works looked much the same. Only when people walked inside did they understand that something fundamental had changed. The building no longer existed for industry. It existed for remembrance. On a bright autumn morning, Calvin unlocked the museum entrance just after sunrise. The air carried the scent of damp leaves. A thin layer of fog drifted above the river beyond the factory grounds. He paused outside for a moment, listening. Birds, wind, the distant sound of traffic. 12 years ago, mornings here had sounded different. Forklifts, compressors, diesel engines, shift whistles. Thousands of workers moving through routines they assumed would last forever. Now there was quiet, but not emptiness. There was a difference. Calvin understood that now. Inside the main lobby, sunlight filtered through restored windows. Photographs lined the walls. Generations of workers stared back from black and white portraits. Some smiled, some looked tired, some appeared younger than the children now visiting the exhibits. Every face represented a life, a family, a story, a contribution, the kinds of things people rarely think about until they are nearly lost. Calvin switched on the lights and began his usual morning walk through the museum. He had become a volunteer guide almost by accident. At first, he only helped organize archives. Then he answered questions. Then visitors began requesting him specifically, not because he was an expert historian, because he remembered. People liked hearing stories from someone who had actually been there, someone whose hands still carried traces of the work. As he entered the archive wing, he noticed movement near one of the exhibits. A teenage boy stood alone reading a display about turbine maintenance crews. School field trips arrived often. Most students rushed through exhibits quickly. This boy wasn't moving. He was studying every photograph, every caption, every name. Calvin approached quietly. "Find something interesting?" The boy looked up, a little startled. "Sorry." "No need." The boy glanced back toward the display. "My grandfather worked here." Calvin smiled. "What's his name?" The boy pointed. There, among a group photograph from 1976, stood a man wearing coveralls and a hard hat. His name appeared beneath the image. Calvin recognized him immediately. "Your grandfather taught welding." The boy's eyes widened. "You knew him?" "Worked with him." The teenager stared at the photograph again. For several seconds he didn't speak. Then he said something that stayed with Calvin long after. "I never met him." Calvin looked at the image, at the young worker frozen in time, then back at the boy. "No?" The teenager shook his head. "He died before I was born." A silence settled between them. Not awkward, just thoughtful. The kind of silence people share when they suddenly realize history isn't abstract. It's personal. The boy studied the photograph carefully, almost searching it, trying to connect pieces of a life he had never witnessed. Finally he smiled. "At least now I know what he looked like." Calvin felt something tighten gently in his chest. Not sadness, something warmer, because that was the entire reason the archive existed. Not simply to preserve information. The boy eventually rejoined his classmates. Yet the moment lingered. Later that afternoon, Calvin found Elena working in one of the restoration rooms. Stacks of newly donated materials surrounded her desk. Photographs, blueprints, boxes waiting to be cataloged. The work never seemed to end. "You were right," Calvin said. Without looking up, Elena smiled. "About what?" "This place." She leaned back in her chair. "That's suspiciously vague." Calvin laughed. "A year ago I thought you were trying to save a building. And now?" He looked through the nearby window. Visitors moved between exhibits. Children pointed at old machinery. Former workers exchanged stories. Families wandered through the halls. "Now, I think you were trying to save people." For a moment, Elena said nothing. Then she nodded. "Maybe." Outside, afternoon sunlight stretched across the factory yard, the same yard that once stood abandoned beneath rain and darkness. The same yard where Calvin first saw impossible lights glowing through a storm. Sometimes he still thought about that night, how easily he could have driven past, how easily he could have ignored it. How many stories would have disappeared if nobody had asked questions? As evening approached, visitors gradually departed. Doors closed. Lights dimmed. The building settled into its familiar quiet. Before leaving, Calvin stopped in the archive one final time. Rows of preserved history surrounded him. Thousands of voices, thousands of lives, protected now. Not because they were famous, not because they were powerful, because they mattered. That distinction felt important. The world often celebrated extraordinary people, yet most towns were built by ordinary ones. Mechanics, operators, welders, drivers, technicians, custodians. People whose names rarely appeared in history books. People who quietly kept things running. People who deserved to be remembered too. As he switched off the final light, Calvin glanced back across the room. The darkness arrived slowly, peacefully, not as an ending, as a continuation. The factory had once generated power for an entire region. Now it generated something different, a sense of belonging, a bridge between generations, a reminder that even forgotten places can still serve a purpose. Outside, the evening sky deepened into shades of blue and gold. The old smokestack stood against the horizon, steady, familiar, enduring, and as Calvin locked the door behind him, he realized something simple. The factory had never truly come back to life. The people had.